Hello again, this is Lino Tados, and this is part 3, the final part of our Sitefinity injections of models into existing widgets. And in this final one, we will do a little bit more advanced stuff, which is we're going to be using something like a selector, like the page selector, image selector, or library selector inside of the designer itself and get access to it from the view itself. So let's go ahead and get started. All right, let's go back to Visual Studio and go ahead and open up maybe our CS HTML for the designer view. I'm going to open up resource package again, go all the way down to news, and there is my original one that I added my description to. What I'd like to do in here is to actually add a selector. And by the way, if you go to the documentation, let me bring in that page, it's important. In the documentation, they will tell you library selectors and how to use them. So you'll see that is in the SF list selector, for instance, whether you're going to use single item or multiple item. There is difference between the S at the end of the selected item or items. We're going to use it with only one selector. So I'm going to use something like the one in here, for instance, from the documentation. These are all the different attributes that you can pass: selected item, ID, selected item, the one with an S for the plural one, the multi-selection, the SF provider, and even you can pass the SF media type, which is optional to tell us if this is for images or for videos or for documents and so on. So the library selector will be great to use. So let's go ahead and see how that will work. So I'm going to go right below this div in here, and let's go ahead and add a div that says my library selector, and I'm going to copy and paste from the documentation the SF list selector. It is a library selector. Multi-select equals to false. You'll have to choose only one, not multiple libraries. Sortable equal to true. You can or you don't have to pass the SF media type. It will work either way, but I like to always put it in here to tell the library selector I'm looking for images. The provider in here is coming in from the provider name. It's already built into the news, so we don't have to do anything about that. But the next two here are very important. This is the SF selected item ID, and that's pretty much the GUID of the library in the database itself, and then this SF selected item, and that is the piece that will have information like a JSON object that will contain a lot of information about the library itself. So these two are two very important ones. I actually currently in my own model, I do not have a selected item or a selected item ID because, believe it or not, libraries are not being used on the model for the news coming in from Sitefinity. So I have to add this functionality, which is the selected item ID and the selected item. So I need to add that to my models. Let's go ahead and do that. So we'll go find out what our view model is at. That is the MVC. That is my new view. Remember, I only had my description here in the content list view model. Let's go ahead and add these two new properties. One of them is the selected item and one is selected item ID. Both of them are strings. One will contain the GUID and one will contain the JSON object that describes everything about the library. Great. Of course, we have to duplicate that in the model itself. So let's go in here. Other than just my description, I am going to add my string selected item and selected ID. And don't forget, of course, to assign the view model for these two items directly to the one built into the new class. So I'm going to go right after the view model assignment, and we will have two more, one for, let me use that as a lowercase and this one as a lowercase as well. Okay, so the view model for the selected item and the selected item ID are pointing exactly to the one in my class. Hopefully that makes sense based on the part 2 of these 3 video series, and it makes sense to you at this point. I am hoping so far that everything we've done makes sense to you. I want you to focus with me in the next couple of minutes because this is the part that difficult to find documentation on to understand how this will work. So first of all, if I run the code as is right now, you will not be able to see the library selector in the designer, even though you're not going to get an error, because whenever you want to use one of the dozens of selectors built into Sitefinity, you have to declare that in a JSON file that is associated with designer view. That means if I go down in here to my designer view.simple.cs HTML, that is not enough. I will have to create a JSON file. Let me go ahead and create one. We'll say add a JSON file. And that also will have to be called with exactly the same name, designer view. And again, we know that the dot is not going to work. So let's say okay for right now and just add the dot simple. It has to be the same name as the CS HTML file. We'll say dot simple like that. And in the JSON file itself, I will actually be able to use one or more. There's 4 of them, the things that you can use in the JSON. First of all, there are something called priority. priority like that, and we'll set the priority to 1. And that means that if there is more than one designer view, because you don't have to have only one in here, like the simple one, you can have multiple, maybe one for admins, one for authors, and one for the regular public that are having access to the back end. You can have multiple one. The one with the priority one is the one that will show up automatically when somebody clicks on edit. And the next one is the interesting one, which is every time you are going to use a selector or any kind of components, you have to have them here as an array. So I'm going to say, as you can see in the JSON file, components, and then you'll open up an array. And the news by itself already brings in a lot of different selectors, like page selector, expander, loading, style drop down. But in our case in here, we have to add these two, the SF list selector and the SF library selector. These two, if they're not in here, unfortunately, you'll not get an error. It's just nothing will show up in the designer. These have to be in here because you are using a selector right there. This SF selector is not enough for it to show up. You have to have that components added in the array for the JSON to make it work. And even with that, I'm still going to show you the error. Actually, it's not really an error. It's something like a glitch that drives people crazy. Let me show you what will happen when we run it just the way it is right now. I'm going to go ahead and compile. Right click and say build this guy. And I'll come back as soon as it finished building and compiling the site. All right, and it finished compiling. Now see this, the part that drives a lot of people crazy. Look what happens when I click on edit in here. Hey, look at that. I get my div, my selected library, and I have my select button. And even if I go to advanced, remember, because I already used the reflect inherited properties in the model, not only will I see my description right there, but if you go down a little bit, you did a good job. Selected item and selected item ID now got added as well. So we are in pretty good shape, right? But look what happens when I click on the select. If you click on the select in here, you will get the selected library, right? That is the correct selector. It is showing. But my two libraries, I have one called default library and one I called Lino library. They are not showing up at all. So something is missing, something I forgot or maybe not very well documented to show you how to actually use that. And the issue here is that there is some JavaScript inside of the select a library dialog that comes from Sitefinity that has to be included in the JSON file. Otherwise it will not work, or actually it will semi-work. The CS/HTML syntax will show up, but any JavaScript that needs to traverse, for instance, a tree view to show you the names coming in will not fire because the JavaScript is not included in your own designer view. That's why, and the weird thing is you can actually click on them and it will work. Their ID will work, but unfortunately you will not be able to see the names in here. So it's kind of semi-working. So that's not good enough for me. I need to actually make sure that the JavaScript file on this library is actually executing. So the way to fix that, let me cancel this and go back to Visual Studio one more time. I will need to go, where is Visual Studio? There you go. I will need to go to the JSON file one more time. And we're going to use another element in here. And this time is going to be the scripts element. So we have four really. We have priority, scripts, components, and there is a fourth one which is called hidden in case you want to hide your designer. But these are the only four. The scripts is very important. And you will need to be passing the client components selectors media sf-library-selector.js. How would you know about all of that stuff? Well, in the documentation, there is a list. Let me bring in this document in here. There is a list of selector scripts. So this is the one I'm using, the SF selectors in here from common for date time, for dynamic modules, even for the news. If you would like to use the selector for the news, this SF news selector and item selector, these are things that are very important for you to include in that JSON file. If you're going to use a page selector, read those. These are the names of the JS that you'll have to include. Otherwise, the functionality of the dialog will not work. So put that in mind as well. In my case in here, I want the SF library selector, and this is always going to be the path, client component selectors, and then put a slash, and sometimes it's media, sometimes it's page, sometimes it's taxonomy. In my case, the SF library will always be under the media, and this is how you're going to get to it right away. Let's save this guy. We'll compile it one more time. And let's see if that will work. I will right click and say build, and I'll be back as soon as it finished building all that. All right, we finished compiling. Now look what happens when I click on edit in there. Still Lino was here from the description, but now when I click on select in here, notice the default library and the Lino library. These are the two libraries that I have in my image selectors as libraries. So they will show up just because I executed the JavaScript inside of the dialog, which you'll have to do something about it to make it happen. And now when I say, for instance, the Lino library, and we'll say done selecting, and we'll say save, automatically whatever, if I use it in my view, it will show up in here. And if I go back to edit, it will remember all that. You see, the Lino library, and I can change it and do whatever I want. Isn't that great? So I'm going to say save there. And just to be complete, let me see if I can actually change the view as well to show you values coming from there. That should be easier now that you've learned how to do it in part 2. If I go back to my Lino list, news list, remember when I said news Lino model.myDescription, now I can actually steal that div, and let's go ahead and get a couple of those. There's one, and there is a second. And instead of saying my description, maybe this one will say dot, and hopefully selected item will be in here. There it is. Let's do the selected item ID. Selected item ID to get the GUID itself for this one. And the last one will put the entire JSON object for the library. We'll say selected item right there. It could see both of them. Oops, just selected item, Control S to save this guy. And let's go ahead and run it. And do I need to actually recompile? No, I did not change any C# code. I can actually just go back to my my website, just refresh the page in here. We'll say reload, and that will not cause a recompilation. You will not see the gears at this point from this guy. It will just bring up the page itself, so there will be no gears on this one. All right, and look at that, it already did it. That is the Lino was here. That is the library ID. And also you get the full object itself in here that has, you see the JSON object has a lot of information, including the ID itself and the name of the Lino library. And if I change it to something else, let's say change it, for instance, to the default library instead. Let's say default library. Let me just click on the default library, done selecting and save. Notice there's a completely different one. There's a default library with a completely different GUID. So I can access whatever choices that you have made in the designer directly into the view and make use of it however you'd like. Hopefully this was useful to you. Got a pretty good idea about some of the tips and tricks that you have to do to get these things injected into current widgets so they can change their functionality. And hopefully we'll see you again in new videos on Lino TV. Thank you.